1876 and is a constitutional republic, having three separate but co-equal branches, the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of those governments whose duties and powers are defined and constrained by the U.S. Constitution. Well, maybe. In 1801, however, this report states that John James Marshall became the fourth Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court and usurped the U.S. Constitution by making his judicial branches of the U.S. government more powerful than the executive and legislative ones combined, thus instituting over America a system of government known as judicial tyranny. Left nearly alone in fighting against Chief Justice Marshall's institution of judicial tyranny to replace the U.S. Constitution was the American founding father and its third president, Thomas Jefferson, who is warning of what the judicial branch was doing, wrote, "Our Constitution, intending to establish three departments, coordinated and independent that they might check each other and balance one another, it has given, according to this opinion of mine, to one of them alone the right to prescribe rules for the government of others, and to do that one, too, which is unelected by and independent of the nation itself. The Constitution, on this hypothesis, is a mere thing of wax in the hands of the judiciary, which they may twist and shape into any form they please. The original error was in establishing a judiciary independent of the nation itself, and which, from the citadel of the law, can turn its guns on those they were meant to defend, and control and fashion their proceedings to its own will. Nothing in the Constitution has given them, the federal judges that is, a right to decide for the executive branch, more than to the executive branch to decide for them. The opinion which gives to the judges the right to decide that law are constitutional, and what not only for themselves in their own sphere of action, but for the legislative and executive also in their spheres, would make the judiciary a despotic branch. At the establishment of our constitutions, the judiciary bodies were supposed to be the most helpless and harmless members of the government. Experience, however, soon showed in what they were to become the most dangerous, of course, that the insufficiency of the means provided for their removal gave them a freehold and irresponsibility in office, that their decisions, seeming to concern individual suitors only, pass silent and unheeded by the public at large, that these decisions, nevertheless, became law by precedence, sapping by little and little the foundations of the Constitution, and working its change by construction before anyone has perceived that that invisible and helpless worm has been busily employed in consuming its substance. In truth, man is not made to be trusted for life if secured against all liability to account. With neither the executive or legislative branches of the United States government exerting their rights under the Constitution to interpret its meanings for themselves, as they are supposed to do, America has been continued to be ruled by judicial tyranny, thus creating a highly distorted system of governance where judicial fiat is substituted for the will of the people, and unelected judges become more powerful than the representatives elected by citizens to protect their own interests. The consequences to the American people of being ruled over by the distorted system of judicial tyranny instead of the Constitution has seen their nation being continuously roiled and divided by needless conflict because critical decisions affecting their lives they were supposed to decide for themselves by voting were instead illegally decided for them without their being allowed to have their voices heard. The worst of them being the Dred Scott decision that threw their nation into civil war, the Roe versus Wade decision that has killed tens of millions of babies in their mothers' wombs, no doubt, and the Obergefell versus Hodges decision that forced homosexual marriage on a nation whose Christian peoples vehemently opposed it. In their creation of the Constitution to govern the United States constitutional republic, America's founding fathers knew divisive issues would arise that could split apart their nation, and is why they created the individual states to be independent entities unto themselves, not subordinate to the federal government, however, thus meaning that if the peoples of one state wanted to legalize abortion, they could, but if another state outlawed abortion, that would be acceptable too, with the only constraint upon these states being that all of them had to obey the Bill of Rights, which, of course, they all derived their freedoms from. Most importantly, their citizens being able to leave a state whose laws they opposed to live in one whose laws they supported. So examples are a U.S. federal judge ruling it was unconstitutional for the legislative branches to have passed a law forbidding the sexual molestation of baby girls. A U.S. federal judge furiously tried to stop the executive branch from putting on its 2020 census form a question asking if the person is a legal U.S. citizen or not. A U.S. federal judge blocking the executive branch again from legally enforcing U.S. immigration laws. A U.S. federal judge blocking a state from legally trying to enforce its own laws. A New York state judge granting a writ of habeas corpus to an elephant in a zoo seeking its freedom. A U.S. federal judge presiding over a case where a deeply religious Christian baker is being persecuted for his refusing to make a 3-tiered white cake with cheesecake frosting that on its top would be a large feature of Satan licking a 9-inch black you-know-what. With no evidence existing that the legislative branch has ever exercised its duty under the Constitution to keep the judicial branch in check, the same cannot be said about the executive branches either, that has first displayed in 1832 when President Andrew Jackson declared about a U.S. Supreme Court ruling, made against him, of course, that John Marshall had made his decision, now let him enforce it, and that afterwards saw Jackson following the Constitution exactly by his interpreting what it meant, as all three branches of the U.S. government are supposed to do to keep any one of them from becoming more powerful than the other. Following President Jackson's exertion of executive branch power to interpret the Constitution over the judicial branch was President Abraham Lincoln, who completely ignored a ruling by U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney declaring that Lincoln didn't have the power to throw people in jail without charges or trial, and afterwards saw President Lincoln jail nearly 15,000 people, most of them journalists and newspaper owners. During World War II, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt likewise used his executive branch power to interpret the Constitution against the judicial branch after German Nazi spies were captured on U.S. soil, and that caused Roosevelt to order his Attorney General, they will be tried in a military court, they will be executed, it should happen within 3 weeks, and tell the Supreme Court if they issue a writ of habeas corpus, it will not be honored, of course, and therefore they should not issue it. I am the Commander-in-Chief in wartime. Like President Lincoln, Jackson, and Roosevelt, this report concludes that current President Donald Trump is a wartime leader too, and whose views of executive branch power in interpreting the Constitution mirrors those of his predecessors who previously stood up to judicial branch tyranny, and whose main target is the 80-year-old Clinton regime-appointed Supreme Court Associate Justice Stephen Breyer, who has previously said that the laws of other countries have a bearing on America's own. That stands in direct opposition of President Trump declaring himself a nationalist whose only interest is the American people, not the world, thus clearly showing that President Trump is clearly to end the insanity of judicial tyranny over his nation once and for all, but whose enemies will come against him with everything they have to prevent it.